Sertorius belonged to the losing side in the Civil War, and Sulla ordered his search and capture as he was on his way to Hispania to assume his role as proprietor. Get to know the beginnings of Sertorius here and now. 82 years BC, Sertorius left for Superior Hispania to take the position of proprietor. But along the way, Sulla marked his name on the list of public enemies, so if anyone murdered Sertorius, they would get off with total impunity. Furthermore, Sulla dismissed Sertorius from his role and replaced him with Valerius Flaccus. But Sertorius refused to bow to Sulla's side, so he refused to give up his troops and continued his march. Usually the landing would take place at Victories, but the port was blocked by Valerius's troops, so he decided to cross a mountainous pass in the Pyrenees. There he was blackmailed by an Iberian tribe, the Ceretani, who asked him for money to let him pass. Sertorius did not hesitate for a moment, as what he needed was time, not money, since Sulla had sent Gaius Annius with an army to hunt him down. Sertorius paid the toll, crossed the Pyrenees, and left Salinator, one of his officers, in command of 6,000 men. He was to defend the pass to prevent Annius from crossing and making things more difficult for him in Hispania. Sertorius knew what he was doing. Defending a mountain pass is a very easy task, even against a numerically superior enemy, as was already proven, for example, in the Battle of Thermopylae. Shortly after leaving, Sertorius Salinator was assassinated by his own men, who had been bribed by Gaius Annius. So the latter was able to cross the Pyrenees and join forces with Valerius Flaccus without any delay. Suddenly, Sertorio found himself with 3,000 men having to face a greatly superior force, so he fled to take refuge in Cartagonova, determined to play defensively. But once there, he thought better of it and decided to flee to Africa. From this moment on, Sertorius will live adventures worthy of the Greek legends of Troy and the Iliad. First, Sertorius landed in Libya, but they were immediately attacked by natives. There, the populace weighed whether it was worth fighting against the natives or it was better to leave and look for a place where they would be better received. Finally, Sertorius decided that it was best to leave the place, so the Romans embarked again and returned to Hispania. They arrived at the south coast of the peninsula, and after disembarking, they were attacked again, this time by the Optimates. Sertorius embarked his men again and headed to the Balearic Islands. There he allied with the pirates, and together they took the island of Ibiza. Let's remember that the pirates had been expelled from the islands many years ago by Quintus Metellus. Sertorius established his base of operations in Ibiza, with the idea of being able to coordinate attacks on the peninsula from there, as an island is a difficult position to conquer. But his peace didn't last long, as Annius sent a fleet of triremes with a legion to finish him off. Here Sertorius found himself in a dilemma. He could wait for the Optimates to disembark, thus leading to a pitched battle in which he was a great strategist. Although he was clearly outnumbered, he couldn't count on pirates to help him on the ground, as they were neither trained nor willing to fight soldiers in open field. The other option was to join forces with the pirates and together sail with their own fleet to confront the Optimates at sea. The pirates were more skilled than the soldiers when fighting on deck, so he would have that point in his favor. In addition, the pirate ships were much more maneuverable than the Roman triremes, so they could quickly reinforce any weak point of the front. Sertorius leaned toward the second option, and the fleet made up of pirates and people set sail from Ibiza to meet the Optimates. However, a storm hit both fleets as they were heading to battle, causing havoc, especially in the People's Navy, which lost almost half of its personnel. When the storm subsided 10 days later, the populares fled the area heading west. With the intention of getting as far away as possible from the Optimates and their fleet, they crossed the strait and landed at the mouth of the Guadalquivir. There, some sailors told him stories of idyllic islands in the Atlantic, a paradise on earth. where he could spend the rest of his days without the complications or hardships of war. These islands were probably the Canary Islands. Sertorius was almost convinced, although he finally decided that a peaceful life was not for him, that he preferred the adrenaline of war and military life. So he embarked his men and crossed the strait again, determined not to surrender. This time they landed in Mauritania and took part in a dynastic dispute, fighting against Ascalis, who was Sulla's claimant to the throne. The dictator, when he learned that Sertorius was in Mauritania, sent an army of legionnaires under the command of Paziano to finish him off. But Sertorius, a brilliant strategist, was the one who came out victorious and killed Paziano himself. Ascalis took refuge in Tingis, now Tangier, and was subjected to a siege by Sertorius and his Mauritanian allies. Tingis finally fell and the dynastic dispute came to an end. Sertorius had achieved his first victory since the death of Gaius Marius, and his name became known throughout the nearby lands, the lands of Hispania. In the year 80 before Christ, a Lusitanian embassy arrived in Mauritania requesting to meet with Sertorius. These men, drawn by the fame and prestige of Sertorius, asked him to return to the peninsula and free them from the pressure of the governor of Hispania. Ulterior. 10 days later, Sertorius agreed. With 2,600 legionaries and 700 Libyans under his command, he set sail for Hispania, with the intention of taking the provinces, regardless of his clear numerical inferiority. 80 years before Christ, Sertorius left Africa for Hispania with 2,600 infantry and 700 Libyans. On the way, his fleet was intercepted by General Aurelius Cotta near Tarifa. Actually, it is not known if the confrontation took place on the way to Hispania or days after arriving. The fact is that the Optimate fleet was defeated, and Sertorius achieved his first victory in his new life as a Hispano-Roman leader. Sertorius knew the Hispanos very well, and knew of their religious devotion, so he decided to take advantage of it to earn their support. A farmer gifted him a newly born white doe of a pure white color, and it was so docile that it followed Sertorius everywhere, not scared by the shouts and noises typical of the army. Sertorius told his men and allies that it was Artemis who had gifted him the doe, for the deer is the animal that represents her. Sertorius. When he received information from his spies about imminent enemy attacks, he said it had been whispered to him, the doe, to convince his allies that the gods supported him. The Lusitanians, convinced, gave him 4,000 warriors and 700 riders for the fight against Sulla. Sertorius decided that he must reap quick victories before more reinforcements arrived on the peninsula. Thus he set off to meet the praetor of that year from Hispania Ulterior, Lucius Fufidius, who was with his men near the river Betis. He confronted him and defeated him, thus becoming the master of part of Hispania Ulterior. Afterward, he retired to Lusitania. There he decided to start training his allies as if they were Roman legions, to provide them with moral discipline and experience, in order to be able to face Sulla in open battle at some point. In the year 79 before Christ, Sulla sent Quintus Caecilius Metellus Pius, one of his trusted men, as proprietor of Hispania Ulterior, in command of 2 legions. Shortly after arriving, he headed towards La Cobriga, a city supporting Sertorius. It's not exactly known where it was, as it is identified with the current Lagos and the same time with some ruins near the current Carrion de los Condes. Since he was the praetor of further Spain, we are going to suppose that it is the current Lagos. For his part, the propraetor of hither Spain, Marco Domicio Calvino, marched parallel to the Tagus, heading to the rebels' lair. Sertorius was training his allies, but they were not yet ready, and also they were clearly outnumbered. So he decided to emulate Viriathus and start a guerrilla war. He sent Lucius Herculeus, one of his officers, to stop Calvino, whom he defeated and harassed during his return to hither Spain. For his part, Sertorius's extensive spy network allowed him to know the Optimate's intentions at all times. In fact, Plutarch narrates that when a military tribune asked Metellus about his intentions, he replied, "If I believed my tunic knew it, I would take it off and throw it into the fire. Nevertheless, this caution was useless as Sertorius learned of Metellus's intentions. The Optimate intended to cut off the water supply to La Cobriga to make them surrender due to thirst. To get there quickly, he had only taken rations for 5 days, as the city would surrender in 2 without water. Error. Sertorius bought 2,000 wineskins or full water jugs and brought them to the city before Metellus arrived. When the Optimate arrived and saw that the city would not surrender, he quickly sent a legion to seek supplies to sustain the siege. Another mistake. This legion was ambushed by Sertorius in a pass, and most were killed or captured. After losing, Metellus lifted the siege and retreated to friendly lands. The war started well for Sertorius. Metellus decided to fight defensively for a while, as time initially played in his favor. He reinforced the border with Lusitania, building forts from which to stop invasions, notably Mytilene, which would later become a colony and lead to the present-day Medellin. This camp also served as a springboard to leap into Lusitania. Sertorius founded his own senate. Sertorius's idea was to create a kind of parallel Rome until he could return to the real one. Exploiting the intense anti-Roman feelings in Celtiberia, he took over part of Citerior Spain, taking cities like Caliguras and Ilerda, now Calahorra and Lleida, and established his base of operations in Huesca. It was also there that he created a school for the children of the leaders of the main tribes of Hispania. This had a dual purpose. Firstly, he sought to Romanize the peninsula and ingratiate himself with the natives, which would provide him with troops to confront Sulla. But on the other hand, these children were also hostages, so the tribes would not rise up against Sertorius, as he was the one controlling their heirs. Anyway, this academy provides a lot of culture and wisdom to the students. It taught them knowledge they couldn't have acquired at their homes, plus it taught them to speak and write in Latin and Greek. Sertorius appointed governors in the various regions he owned and named himself proconsul. Additionally, he substantially worked the taxes of all the inhabitants of his territories, which made him even more popular among the Hispanos. With an already established territory and more or less defined institutions, he trained and equipped his allies in pure Roman style with superior weapons, shields, and armor. But the civil war persisted beyond Hispania. A General Lepidus had rebelled against the Senate. I'm not going to go into this because it's not the point of the video, I'll just say that. His rebellion ended with 53 cohorts, over 20,000 legionnaires opposed to Sulla, and commanded by Marcus Perpenna, living in Sardinia. So great was Sertorius's fame that in the year 78 before Christ, Perpenna left the island with his men and departed to Hispania, in order to join forces with Sertorius and together have more chances of bending Sulla and defeating the Optimates. Perpenna didn't have the charisma or intellect of Sertorius and still refused to take orders from him. He preferred to go on his own. However, due to the pressure from his men, he finally put himself at the service of Sertorius. And now, with an army of 60,000 infantrymen and 8,000 cavalrymen, Sertorius had become a serious problem. A new Viriathus that no one wanted to face. No one, except a young general with an impeccable military career. His name was Pompey the Great. Hispania was once again fighting for its freedom. Year 78 before Christ, Sertorius, with his enemies cornered, set off in the direction of Caraca, a city located near the Tajuña River that resisted his power. Its inhabitants took refuge on a high hill, full of caves, all of which faced north. The entrance to the caves was practically impregnable, as a few men could defend the access without problems. Due to the climb's steepness, and how exposed the attackers were, knowing that a direct assault would be a slaughter and possibly end in failure, Sertorius scouted the place on horseback. He verified that they would not be able to build a ramp because the quality of the earth was poor. It was like ash and was carried away by the wind. As Plutarch tells it, Sertorius found no other entrance to the caves, but he noticed a whirlwind picking up a handful of sand and lifting it to the height of the caves. And then he had an idea. He ordered his men to start accumulating that earth on the north face of the hill, which is where the caves were facing. So they spent the day accumulating more and more earth, under the mockery of the rebels who knew that this earth would not be useful for making a ramp. The next day the wind picked up again, and once again a whirlwind of dust arose next to the embankment. At that moment, the Romans started to run and jog over the earth they had accumulated the day before. The small whirlwind was fed with more and more dust until it began to enter the caves and flood everything. Since it was the only entrance to the cave, there was no ventilation, and the rebels began to cough and suffocate. Finally, they surrendered. In 76 BC, Pompey entered outer Spain with 30,000 men and headed for Valencia. Sertorius sent Hirtileo to harass Metellus in the ulterior, and Perpenna to stop Pompey at the Ebro line. He had given both of them crystal-clear instructions. No engaging the bulk of the enemy army in open field. Always skirmishes or sure battles. Spoiler ignored his advice. Perpenna wasn't skilled, and Pompey escaped him and managed to cross the Ebro at a poorly defended point, continuing towards Valencia. His intention was to take all the coastline and that Sertorius would not have access to the Mediterranean. He avoided Tarraco, but took Sagunto and continued marching south. Here I'm going to emphasize something that now lacks importance, but will have it when we see the Second Civil War. In the territories Pompey controlled, he began to create a patronage network that would ensure that the inhabitants were loyal to him alone. We'll see its future consequences. Now let's continue with Sertorius. Indeed, Sertorius took command of the army and personally set off to stop Pompey, deciding to give battle near Lauro. The location of this city is not known, but it must not have been very far from Valencia. And here the Battle of Lauro took place. This battle seems quite interesting to me, as it shows the desert imagination at its finest, as well as the first defeat of Pompey, so far considered invincible. That's why I'll make an exclusive video of this battle. I'm going to summarize it quickly. Pompey failed miserably. Out of his 30,000 men, he lost 10,000 as well as his entire supply convoy. At night, Pompey withdrew from the camp, losing another 5,000 men. In this case, allies he had left defending his rear. The city of Lauro, seeing that Pompey had lost, surrendered to Sertorius. He spared the lives of its inhabitants, but set fire to the city as punishment for having opposed his power. Meanwhile, Hirtileo in Hispania disobeyed Sertorius and confronted Metellus despite being outnumbered, on open ground near Italica, south of present-day Santa Ponce. In Seville, Metellus was victorious, and Hirtileo's army had to flee to Lusitanian territory loyal to Sertorius. However, Metellus pursued him and finally finished him off near present-day Segovia. Hirtileo's entire army vanished. And it's here when the tables began to turn for Sertorius, who until then had been reaping victory after victory. While it is true that he remained practically invincible, such a vast territory requires not only an army and a general, and if the other officers are not skilled, the war is lost. In the year 75 BC, taking advantage of Sertorius being in the center of the peninsula, Pompey tried again to take Valencia. Defending Valencia was Perpenna, who faced Pompey without hesitation, again disregarding Sertorius's instructions to avoid a large-scale pitched battle. This time Pompey did claim victory and ended the lives of 10,000 warriors. Perpenna retreated with the survivors of his army, but the damage was already done. Rome could replenish troops almost without limit. Sertorius, not Pompey, confident in his victory, decided to face Sertorius again. He advanced with his men towards Sertorius's positions without waiting for Metellus's reinforcements, who had left from further Spain and would arrive by sea to hither Spain shortly. Sertorius needed to fight as soon as possible to face only Pompey's army, and not against two at the same time, so he went to meet Pompey. A battle occurred at Sucro near the Jucar River. Sertorius ordered the attack at dusk and both armies were fighting until night. Sertorius had about 3,000 casualties, while Pompey had about 6,000. The next day, Sertorius arranged his men in battle order, but he saw from afar that Metellus was arriving in the area with his men, so he changed his mind and retreated with his army to save territory. Once Sertorius left, Perpenna decided to present battle near Arche, now known as Sagunto. Again he was defeated, losing about 5,000 men to the troops of Metellus and Pompey. With this battle, the campaigns of that year ended, with Sertorius watching his generals lose battles, how his forces were dwindling, slowly but inexorably. The Selanes had decided to change their tactic, and Sertorius was feeling more and more cornered. 74 BC, Sertorius urgently needed reinforcements. To accomplish this, he negotiated with Mithridates, king of the Pontus kingdom, to deliver 3,000 talents of silver and 40 ships to Sertorius, in exchange for him sending military advisors. Let's remember that Mithridates had been the trigger for the First Roman Civil War, or at least the reason why it broke out. If you want to learn about the First Roman Civil War, click on the link located at the top of the screen. Well, while we're at it, you can also take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you don't miss any episode of our story. I'm going to make a note that I've made several times on the channel already. History is written by the victors, and the data may not be entirely accurate. In the campaigns of Sertorius, I have encountered contradictory sources. The number of troops or a resolution of sieges like that of Cjbeards, which we will see later. What I want to say is that again, I'm going to make an account that, in my opinion, is plausible, based on several of the available sources. And now let's continue. For his part, Pompey asked, or we could even say demanded from the Roman senator the sending of troops, money, grain, weapons, and equipment for his men. The Senate agreed, and Pompey and Metellus received what they had requested. The numerical superiority of the Selanes was overwhelming. But even so, they decided to avoid having battles in open field, so as not to lose troops if necessary. Instead, they decided to corner Sertorius and his loyal followers gradually. It was like emulating the strategy that Rome followed to defeat Viriathus. Metellus took the city of Bybulus, near present-day Calatayud. Meanwhile, Pompey took the city of Cauca and headed towards Palencia. Here he laid siege to the city and through tunnels brought down the walls. Just before launching the siege, Sertorius arrived to rescue the city and challenged the Scylan army to a battle. Pompey, afraid of being caught between Sertorius's troops and the city's defenders, withdrew, renouncing to take Palencia. Pompey then headed to Cjbeards, where he joined forces with Metellus. They besieged the city together. Meanwhile, Sertorius helped Palencia to rebuild the walls, and when the works were finished, he headed for Cjbeards. He arrived and killed 3,000 enemies in battle. Metello and Pompey decided to abandon the siege and retreated to friendly territory to spend the winter. Pompey went to Gaul, while Metello went to further Spain, where he was received with cheers by its inhabitants, who were already quite Romanized. Despite the fact that every time Sertorius went into battle, he came out victorious, he couldn't be on all fronts at the same time, and his generals didn't possess his command capabilities. His territory was diminishing more and more, and squabbles among his officers were increasing. The Romans accused him of becoming barbarized, as he always had an escort of Celtiberian warriors, while the natives complained that they wanted to get rid of the Roman yoke, not to exchange Sulla for Sertorius. And then some of the natives began to abandon Sertorius, declaring themselves neutral or favorable to Sulla. In the year 73 before Christ, Tarraco fell to Pompey, while Metellus also advanced like a steamroller in the year 72 before Christ. Sertorius, tired of being abandoned by the Hispanics, executed some of the students from his academy in Osca, while he sold others as slaves. At this point, Sertorius began to lose his mind, and his temperament became more bloodthirsty, aggressive, and frugal. He indulged in constant feasts, and the conspirators exploited the situation to act. Perpenna, who had never accepted that Sertorius was above him, organized a feast at his villa to which he invited Sertorius. Once Sertorius got drunk, Perpenna and his supporters executed Sertorius and his men. Sertorius's rebellion had ended in a single night, although the war continued. And here we have a new similarity with Viriato. Both were murdered by their own men. Perpenna took command now of all the rebel territories, but the Hispanics abandoned him en masse as they only trusted in Sertorius. Perpenna trusting in his leadership abilities. He faced Pompey in open field and was demolished. I'm going to share my perspective. I honestly don't know what Perpenna was thinking. If every time he led the army into battle he lost, but, well, he was the only leader left in the rebellion. After the battle, Pompey's troops found Perpenna in some bushes and brought him before Pompey, who, to prevent the civil war from continuing, executed him. And now, yes, the first Roman civil war had ended. 10 years after it broke out, Metellus returned to Italy and celebrated a triumph, while Pompey stayed on the peninsula quelling the last pockets of resistance, among which Caligula stood out. According to Plutarch, the siege of this city was on the level of Numancia, in terms of the obstinacy of its defenders not to surrender. The city fell and all the resistance foci were extinguished, so Rome expanded its territories on the peninsula. Pompey now appeared affable and conciliatory, increasing his clientele network. The Vascones, who in one way or another were supporters of Sulla, mainly so that the Cjbeards would be punished, began to be Romanized in a peaceful manner. Pompey also founded new cities like Pompilo, which is now known as Pamplona. The consuls of that year introduced a law so that Pompey could grant Roman citizenship to whoever he deemed appropriate. Pompey skillfully used this law to attract more supporters to his side. So the patronage network that he had created in Hispania was a huge spiderweb that trapped everyone. According to Plutarch, Pompey was a very poor speaker, but he made up for this on the battlefield and by being extremely popular among the citizens of the Republic. The fact that he had created such a large patronage network in Hispania would prove to be very useful. 20 years later. Now I want to point out something about the map. As you can see, in one fell swoop, I have annexed all the towns in the north except for the Gallicos, Asturias, and Cantabrians to the Roman Republic. This is because it is not known when they were annexed. After all, the exact location of Rome's borders in Hispania is not even remotely known. The borders you see in the videos are my estimates, based on the information that exists from that time. Before the Cantabrian Wars, these tribes were already part of Rome in one way or another, so I annexed them already. To be honest, it's true that the Battle of Antagasti took place in 38 BC, but it was really on a small scale, and it's not known if it was part of a conquest campaign. If anyone knows precisely when these peoples became part of Rome, please send me an email with arguments and I am willing to admit my mistake in the next video. And now let's continue. It seemed that everything was calm and that there would finally be peace on the peninsula, but that was only the calm before the storm. Well, 3 years later, the most well-known man in the history of Rome would come to Hispania to start a Sonorum course. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar,